Well, we're creeping up on Easter, and I think it's a good time for us to review the meaning and the place of Jesus Christ in relation to ourselves and God. Now, I know all of you already know everything I'm going to say, but a review never hurts anyone. So we need to know this for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is that we can then understand the total possibilities of our lives and the experiences that we create in our lives. Most of us don't yet know the depth of life's great possibilities. Charles Fillmore put it this way: the average person has not discovered the greater possibilities of his real existence. He's been taught to think that to make a fortune or to make a name for himself are the only things worthwhile. And if he does not happen to have the necessary talent for these accomplishments, there's nothing much for him to do but to merely exist. However, if he's been touched with the force of ambition, or if he has had a glimpse of the ideal, mere existence doesn't satisfy. And as a result, there comes a life of unhappiness and dissatisfaction. There's many a person whose present position in life depends almost wholly upon his financial returns. And if they are small, with no indication of immediate increase, his life seems to be almost, if not wholly, a barren waste. Not because it's a barren waste, but because he has not found the real riches of existence. The trouble with this person is his point of view. He's depending upon things instead of depending upon himself. He must learn that there is something more to life besides salary and the things salary can buy. The value of an individual life is not measured by the quantity of possessions, but by the quality of existence. And this is basically what Jesus was trying to convey. He said the value of life comes from not having much, but simply being much. And of course, the law also holds that he becomes much, that's in consciousness, ultimately comes to have much, in whatever way you want to interpret that. So at some point in being rich, we each come to an understanding of the place of Jesus Christ here and now in the attainment of life's greatest possibilities. And I think some clarification is required in this area, and what our belief is or should be concerning this man Jesus. For example, I might ask, do I believe that Jesus fulfilled the Jews' prophecy of the Messiah, and I thus worship and believe on Jesus to be saved? Or do I believe that the messianic promise was revealed through Jesus in such a way that I realize that the same Christ that indwelled Jesus also indwells in every one of us? Thus, for those folks, or these folks, the way to salvation is to worship God and to learn to apply the teachings of Jesus so that each of us can express the Christ that is within us, as Jesus did. We might also question concerning dogmas, tenets, creeds that have grown up in Christian theology. Our question might be, do I, as a Christian, subscribe to statements, beliefs, creeds about Jesus as the main thrust of my religion? Or do I, as a Christian, seek as the main thrust to understand and apply the teachings of Jesus? Now, as you know, there's a very great division in Christian fellowship about the role of Jesus. There are schisms about the virgin birth, about the color of his skin, about his motives in various activities. There are fights about the ways to observe communion and how many times a year it should be observed. There's endless speculation about how he performed his miracles or whether he really did. Sometimes we have such preconceived notions that we find that we cannot answer those questions for ourselves truthfully. Like the case of the little community down in South Texas. They had a murder there. It was the first one that had ever happened. And more than that, the killer was one of the most popular and well-liked men in town. Well, he entered a plea of guilty and went to trial. But the jurors, all friends of his, determined to save him and rendered a verdict of not guilty. The judge was stunned. How could you bring a not guilty verdict when the defendant has pleaded guilty? Well, said the jury foreman, this fella is such a liar that we can't believe him even under oath. In the reality of life, we simply cannot afford to avoid the truth. We need to seek it, we need to find it for the sake of growing in the experience of good, but we need to make sure that we're getting the right truth. You see, the seeker of truth doesn't consider the things about Jesus as material at all. The proof of the Christening of Jesus lies in his teachings and in his demonstration of the goodness of God. Now, a large measure of our confusion concerning Jesus lies in the rules, the regulations, the processes, the promises, the activities that have been established by men who've claimed to know enough about Jesus to tell us what to do. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It is good and it's proper, but it can also be hurtful and improper. What we need is a test that we can apply to ourselves to determine whether or not a particular creed or tenet is good and helpful to me, to you. So that's where the teachings and demonstrations of Jesus come into full play. And before we look into that test, I think it would be helpful to more clearly keep in mind the role of the universal Christ and Jesus Christ. The question first is, do we have a right to question that role? And it's, in the first place, well to understand that creeds and tenets and rules and so forth are really not necessary. As Fillmore said, Christ is not a person, but a principle. This idea is almost universally misapprehended on the part of both Christians and non-Christians alike. Christ is not a proper name. It is a title. The word Christ comes from the Greek Christos, which in turn is a translation of the Aramaic word mystikika, which is derived from the Aramaic word masaka, or to anoint. Thus, Christ means the anointed one. In ancient days, when a man was selected to be king, he was anointed with oil. Anointing was a simple ceremony equivalent to initiation or consecration. Every one of the kings of Judah was anointed with oil. So the Christ corresponds somewhat to the Hebrew Messiah or to the Eastern Krishna or Buddha, none of which were names, but were titles. The term Christ refers only to God in Jesus. The title was assumed only after his disciples and other followers saw God manifest in that man. The only begotten Son of God is spiritual man, the Christ, which is the identity of every person, including every one of you. Now, regardless of what others have said about the personal man Jesus, Jesus himself never told us to worship his personal self. That would have been asking you to worship an image or an idol of God. When you desire to solve a problem, and this becomes a problem, you must increase your faith. But faith in what? Well, faith in the Christ of God that is within you. This Christ, Jesus revealed to each one of us. And when you're sure that God lives in you, as Jesus was sure, you'll be able to bring about any good that is rightfully yours. That is rightfully yours. Now, that's not said to take anything from Jesus, because Charles Fillmore says he was more than Jesus of Nazareth, more than any other man who ever lived on this earth. He was more than man, as we understand the appellation in its everyday use, because there came into his manhood a factor to which most men are strangers. The factor was the Christ consciousness. The unfoldment of the consciousness of Jesus made him God incarnate, because Christ is the mind of God individualized. We cannot separate Jesus Christ from God or tell where man leaves off and God begins in man. To say that we are men as Jesus was a man is not exactly true, because as Jesus was, because he had developed, or he had dropped that personal consciousness by which we separate ourselves from our true God self. He became consciously one with the absolute principle of being. He had no consciousness separate from that of being. Therefore, he really was this being to all intents and purposes. Yet he attained no more than that what is expected from every one of us. As Jesus said, that they may be one, even as we are one. Now, the truth is that Jesus Christ still lives in our very midst. And that means that we can recognize the Christ in every person as we come to his mental, moral, and spiritual standard. And conversely, we cannot enter that presence when we do not have that kind of feeling. When one has entered this sacred realm, he finds his life is interspersed with that of the Father and of Jesus Christ, so that in essence, there's no distinction between God and Jesus Christ. Because their ideas are synchronized one with the other so perfectly that they are essentially one mind. And we're told that we should have that one mind that was in Jesus Christ, in our own self. So, we could say that Jesus Christ is our authority on attitude and outer activity in relation to ourselves, to others, other people, and God. Now, I know that even in this group, that there are some differences that we perceive about what we think about Jesus. And if you become diligent about it, you can become of a common mind by following the teachings and the demonstrations of Jesus. That's simple to say. It's sometimes kind of hard to do. But anyway, any test of a creed, tenet, canon, rule, or process in religion or any other part of your life can be tested by comparing it with the attitudes and demonstrations that Jesus did. Now notice I didn't say just his words. In the first place, many of Jesus' words are open to widely divergent interpretations, such as different conclusions at different levels for each of his parables. How many of you have ever read a parable one time and said, hey, I got the meaning of this? Then 3 days later, you read that same parable and you said, oh my goodness, I didn't see that the first time. Yes. And then you read it again 3 weeks from then, and you read that same parable and you get another message. That's what I mean. It's open to interpretation. But when you deal first with his attitudes, and then the demonstration that he made of those attitudes, then you have a strong foundation upon which to interpret all the rest of the sayings of Jesus. His first great promise concerned love. The promise being that only through love could we attain mastery over the world and oneness with God. Remember, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. That's Matthew 5:17 if you'd like to look it up. And this means he demonstrated that natural and spiritual law are the same, and that to know and understand spiritual law would uphold the vast untapped areas of natural law that we don't yet know. Did you know there's stuff that we don't know? Even as advanced as our society is now, there are a lot of things that we don't know. And we're finding them, and we'll find them, and we'll continue to find them. Seeking the natural law, like how to multiply the loaves and the fishes, has occupied the mind and resources of a lot of folks for ages. You know, we've only had limited success in trying to figure it out. I don't know of anybody. And you know anybody that's multiplied the fishes and the loaves in your... No, okay. So Jesus was unschooled in natural law, but in truth and spiritual law. And so he was able to easily perform that miracle. And what he's saying by that is that you can do the same thing if you adopt the same attitude and demonstrations that he gave us. The most important aspect of this law was given by John in the 10th chapter, and I'll begin reading at the 31st verse. The 31st verse. The Jews took up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? The Jews answered him, we stone you for no good work, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and Scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you're blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? If I'm not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Now he's telling us who we are. Did you hear that? Telling us who we are. He's telling us about the power that always tends to be leading us. And he points away from his personal self and says that the important thing is to know and to understand, quote, that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Also, we are, as beings, sons of God. Therefore, we are sons of the Father, and the Father is in us, and we are in the Father. And actually, you could say that is a law for each of us to know. Now, Jesus started out his life dealing with love, as expressed in Matthew, the 22nd chapter, and beginning with the 37th verse. And he said to him, the guy come up to him and asked him about it. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and the first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love God. Those two commandments. That's big. So he had previously translated this idea of love into very practical terms. As he said in the 7th chapter of Matthew, the 12th verse, so whatever you wish, that men would do to you, do so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. But he cautions, we're not just talking about outer action, but of inner attitude. This doing to men must be in an attitude of love, not because they love you and act nice toward you, because there's no promise that each good deed you do will be returned by that person to you. It will be returned and multiplied by God using whatever channels are open. And this is what Matthew 5:44 means. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He promotes that the law is that if we judge the other person, that same judgment will work in your own life. Therefore, we should judge righteously, that is, rightly. And so we should love men and be non-condemning of anyone. Now, the reason, as Jesus put it in Matthew 5:17 and 20, think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Scribes and Pharisees followed the law in devotion to the law, but not in devotion to the people that the law affected. This was his complaint. So if you would attain the rich gifts of oneness with God, the gifts of prosperity, wholeness of body, mind, and emotion, harmony, peace, sense of wonderful fulfillment, both your natural and spiritual life, if you would attain these gifts, then you need to be testing every one of the creeds and tenets and rules and activities that you have come across against the simple commandment of Jesus. Now, the question is, does this allow me to truly love myself, my neighbor, and God? That's the question you ask about the tenet, the creed. Does it allow me to judge righteously without condemnation, without anger at the seeming injustice of their action? Does it allow me to give gifts and not require a gift in return? Does it allow me to be closer in bond with my fellow men, even those who persecute me? Or does it tend to separate me from it? Does that creed tenet tend to allow me to forgive? Or does it allow me to continue to pray in eager expectancy the Lord's Prayer? If the tenet, creed, canon, process, rule, whatever, can't allow you to love in an attitude of righteousness, forgiveness, and thankfulness, then it certainly deserves to be critically examined to see, first of all, if you have misunderstood what the creed says. And if you haven't, I wish you would check those things for you. You see that Jesus just simply taught us to do that. He said, hey, if it doesn't sound right, look at it and check it out. Go to God about it. So, in effect, Jesus demonstrated for us what we should do. And then you'll be more free to enter the kingdom of heaven and to experience the gifts that are within that kingdom. Now, we're coming up on Easter, which is a time of great joy and renewal. So this would be a lovely time for you to examine your past and see what there may be still hanging in there of these creeds and tenets and rules and regulations that you had in your previous religion, and see if they're still able to give you the means by which you can judge righteously, with love and not condemnation, with peace and not turmoil. It'll make a darn good Easter if you do it. Bless you all.